What is up, guys? Welcome to the Triage Method podcast. This week, I'm joined by Miss Shannon Beer. Shannon was on the podcast a couple of weeks ago with Paddy, discussing some things more specific to nutrition and health in every size and concepts related to that. So do go back and listen to that episode. In this episode, however, what we're going to do is probably a bit of a broader discussion around some of the things that we kind of just assume are well defined for us. And that is, what does it actually mean to be healthy? What is health? What are the things we should be thinking about when we're trying to pursue better health? Is it something that is actually a pursuit, or is it just a case of removal of things or addition of things? These are all questions that I hope that we will discuss in this episode of the podcast. But before we get there, Shannon, do you want to briefly introduce yourself, your work, your background, etc.? I know you're currently pursuing further studies and you're traveling around, so lots to tell the audience about.
Yeah, sure. Firstly, thank you for having me back on. I am a nutrition coach, so yes, I kind of work online and travel around a bit as much as I can at the moment. I'm currently in Lisbon, and I coach people one-on-one for just helping people to improve their health, from a nutrition perspective, which could be weight loss, weight gain, weight maintenance, whatever it is. But I also have recently started collaborating with Gabrielle Fondaro on comprehensive coaching. So we're taking a broad, I guess we'll touch on this with the things that we're going to talk about in relation to health, but it's a more comprehensive framework for coaching that incorporates a number of skill sets to really help our clients flourish. So improving their health, but across different domains. So we have started a comprehensive coaching community, which is a Facebook group. We've recently done a webinar series. So I've been focusing a lot on that this year. And as you say as well, I've also started some further studies, but I kind of have a few doubts. I kind of might be changing my mind on a few things. I would like to do a psychology conversion course. There's a lot that I want to study outside of academia as well, but yeah, that's kind of I guess a bit to touch on there. But at the moment, I'm studying food, nutrition and health at UCD because my scientific background is not recognised unless it's formal. So yeah, we'll see where that goes. But yeah, that's kind of me briefly in a nutshell.
Yeah, man, the your story about about your lack of scientific background is something that actually frustrates me so much, because I was just speaking with I don't know if you know Catherine Gray. You might have come across her on Instagram, yeah, or know of her. I was speaking with her about a similar issue recently, because she's trying to get into medicine, but like that, she has a Bachelor of Arts, I think, as her background, but like yourself, has been studying voraciously in the areas of nutrition science and areas related to science over the last couple of years, but is encountering all those barriers now because you need a science undergrad, so it is frustrating, because you would assume that in a proper meritocracy that all would matter, that would matter is that you're competent enough to do the job, not that you've got a BSc or a BA. What does it really matter? But anyway, that's a topic for another podcast. For the purpose of this podcast, Shannon, what on earth does it mean to be healthy? You're free to rant for as long as you want on this, and we'll open up some tangents from there.
Yeah, brilliant question. So I've been thinking about this for a while, because I guess health is sort of an abstract concept. And when I work with people, it's I have these goals, and why are these goals important to you? Oh, I'd like to be healthy. So kind of thinking about, well, what does it actually mean to be healthy then? And I have come up with a rough framework on the factors that can influence health, but I do think ultimately that health is going to be determined by the individual. But briefly or broadly, I do think that health expands far beyond the physical domains. So we tend to think of health in terms of, our physical fitness or absence of disease, which I think is just one small part of what it means to be healthy. And I think the reason that this question is important is because the way that we define health will determine the way that we strive towards it. So it's really important to have a clear idea of what we're aiming for. And I really like the concept of flourishing health, which I think is something that you're fairly familiar with too. And I came across this in a paper by Vanderville. I think he's got a couple, one from 2017, one from 2019, on the concept of flourishing health. And it he has kind of six domains of health that make up this concept of flourishing health. So he's got happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, close social relations, and then financial and material stability as a means of securing the other five domains of health. And the word flourishing just means to grow and prosper across different domains of life. And that's kind of what I want for my clients. Like, yes, we're working on these like physique goals or performance goals, but why is that, and for what purpose, and how is this going to impact the rest of your life? And there's been, a number of attempts to define health in the past. Like, you've got the World Health Organization's, their definition, which kind of included the concept of psychological health, which at the time was fairly revolutionary. So their definition would be a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease. So, as I said, that recognition of mental health was revolutionary at the time, but it's still kind of insufficient. It doesn't quite capture all aspects of health. And then what do we mean by complete? What does that mean? Rather than defining health as like a negative state, so we're saying, oh, it's the absence of something, like we should also be considering the positive, like personal dimensions of health as well. So I like to use like this kind of concept of health to inform the approaches that I'll take with a client, or even just the kind of questions I'll ask. Like, again, why is this important to you? Like, what does an improved physical health look like? But what does that allow you to do in your life? So what would you do if you had more energy, or if you felt more confident in yourself? How would that affect the rest of your life? And I think as well, if we're considering mental health, emotional well-being, social health as well, then that again will inform the intervention. Because if, for example, someone is struggling to stick to a diet and they're avoiding social situations because they feel like they can't go out there and eat the foods, or they don't know what's on the menu, so they don't want to go, like that could be impacting their health, which kind of defeats part of what you're trying to achieve. Like, if the goal is to improve your health, but then you're scared to socialize with your friends, then it's like, well, is this really healthy at all? So I just think it's really important to actually have a think about what health means and what it means to you as an individual, because as I say, there's like different pathways and causal mechanisms that can influence our physical health and our psychological well-being, but ultimately it's going to come down to what's really important for an individual. And I think that's what we need to understand if we're going to try to improve our health.
Yeah, and to circle back to that kind of concept of physical health, I think that's actually something that's really important to ponder, because even sometimes when you do see people trying to consider maybe some of the psychological, the social, the cultural domains that kind of come together from a health perspective, what you often see is that they're only discussed as causal pathways to physical health. So it's an interesting way to frame it, because it's like we still always keep that assumption, even when we do broaden the conversation, that the eventual goal is to come back to just these very rigid kind of biomedical definitions of what it actually means to be healthy. And I think that if you actually think about what that means or how it manifests, like in the fitness industry, you see it sometimes where people will justify going outside or walking barefoot because there's some mechanism to do with maybe blue light and training circadian rhythms, or whether maybe it's the redox balance by electrons coming from the ground into your feet, and like these pure speculative things. Like, obviously there are good reasons to go outside for sure from a physical health perspective, but it's just funny that we have to create these kind of like biochemical causal pathways to justify someone doing something that is so inherently human, like going outside, or even things like meditation or spending time with other people for social connection. Those things are never framed in terms of like being the end in and of itself, that like, if I have good relationships, that's a good thing. It's very often coming back to the fact that, oh, if you have better relationships, you'll have lower levels of cortisol, and here's how cortisol affects muscle building or fat loss, so it almost always just drags back again to the physical health concept.
Yeah, it's interesting because, of course, like these different domains of health are interrelated. So, like the things that affect our psychological well-being can have physiological effects in the body as well.
Mhm.
But again, as you say, like we're always tend to focus on physical health, and I think part of that reason might be because it's somewhat more visible and
For sure.
measurable
Yeah.
than the other domains of health. And I think that's kind of a crucial point there, because if we're thinking about improving health just from a physical health perspective, then we're kind of trying to reduce like the complexity of health down to one thing that we can see and measure. And the way that we tend to do that with coaching or just in general is using macros and body weight. And if we're taking a broader conceptualization of health, thinking about health in terms of like flourishing health, then to measure health purely through macros and body weight is epistemically flawed, in my opinion. So that kind of opens up the question. It's like, all right, then I know that self-monitoring can be a crucial part of achieving a change, especially in the initial stages. So if I'm trying to achieve a health on a broader perspective, then how am I going to measure that? What am I looking out for? And what can I use maybe in addition to macros and body weight, or as a substitution for that, so that I'm not just focused on the physical health, which is somewhat more objective, somewhat more measurable, and how am I going to open that up to actually consider other aspects of health as well. But I do think we're just compelled to think about things in terms of physical health, and I think that's part of the reason why is, as I say, it's kind of more measurable, but I don't know what else there is to it.
Yeah, and I think thinking about the trade-offs that one is willing to accept is actually something that's really important here, because this is something that I do actually bring into discussions with clients very often, and that is that you don't have to have all of these domains perfect, and almost always, like, you're not going to have them all perfect. Like, if, for example, if you're pursuing some sort of meaning and purpose, if you consider that domain of health, that may involve you being a very career driven person who works 60 to 80 hours a week, but you wake up each morning and you think, god, I can't wait to get after it today. I see purpose in what I'm doing. And if you're working 60 to 80 hours a week, yeah, there might be weeks where you're going to actually miss your exercise guidelines a little bit. There might be weeks where you're going to sleep a little bit less. And I think realizing that they're actually all coming in to form what it means to be healthy can actually help with those decisions. Because what I've found, I'm not sure if you found this with some clients, is that they'll read Matthew Walker's Why We Sleep or something like that, and suddenly they're so anxious going to bed because they're like, I'm not going to get 8 hours. I'm not going to get 8 hours. I'm going to get heart disease. I'm going to get cancer, all these types of things, because that's all they're thinking about as it relates to their health, that there's this one causal pathway. It's like, all right, sleep, and here's the reason why it's going to harm my health. Therefore, there's no justification for missing sleep. However, if you were to frame it in terms of, well, I stayed up 2 hours later that evening because a friend came over who I hadn't seen in a while, and that actually made me feel great. It's a much broader way of looking at health. Do you find people getting anxious about those types of things in your coaching practice?
Yeah, like for sure. I think it's very easy to fall into the trap of thinking, oh crap, that means I need to maximize like every aspect of my health. But I don't think you need to optimize or maximize anything in order to be healthy overall. It's more about how these things are operating together over a period of time as well. So, like you say, staying up late for one night or two or whatever because you're out spending time with your friends, probably not the end of the world. And if you were chronically sleep deprived, that's kind of a different story. And if you're really pushing hard in your career or even your studies because you've got exam periods coming up, then you might kind of put more time and energy into those things for a period of time, but probably wouldn't want to live your life that way because you might not have any friends to spend time with if you just ignored everyone because all you do is study, for every day of your life.
Yeah.
So I think there's definitely periods where certain aspects of your health will demand more attention and more energy from you, but it probably will even out over time, or at least that's something that we may want to try and facilitate. Is not, I won't call it balance, because as I say, some things may be weighted more heavily than
Yeah.
others, but I just think some kind of congruence with all the different domains of health over a period of time, that's what we're aiming for, not necessarily to maximize or optimize every aspect at once, because again, I as you kind of think, I don't really think that that's possible nor necessary either.
And with all that said, has that changed the way you approach health or your own life in general, in terms of the way that you actually live, since you've been thinking about this stuff?
Yeah, probably a lot more because of my because of the way that I live, like with traveling. I think
Mm.
that if I'm doing that, then I have to be realistic about what I want to achieve. And I also think spend a lot of time thinking about how exactly I want to spend my time, like what am I doing and what's like giving me. So there are times where I'm like sleep deprived because I have to get up in the middle of the night to catch a flight, but that's something that I've accepted as part of the way that I live. There'll be times where I may end up in pre-COVID world, I may have ended up on like an island somewhere, and it's not until I get to the island that I don't realize that there's not a gym there. So I'm like, okay, well, I'm not going to weight train this week, but I can do something else. And that's a compromise I've accepted because I've chosen that that's the way that I want to live my life, essentially. And again, with spending time on things like meaning and purpose, what am I trying to do with my career? What do I want to study? What this is giving me? What problems am I trying to solve? And I could spend a fair bit of time putting a lot of time into reading and education, and then not feel like I want to go out. And again, because the way that I meet people, it's like I have to, because I work on my own and I move around a lot, it's like, well, it's my responsibility to go and meet people. That's something that I have to take time and energy out to do. And sometimes I will, and sometimes I'll be like, oh, I'd rather just like read these things that I have saved that I can't be asked today. Like these are all kind of trade-offs that I
Yeah.
make. But I think having a clear understanding of what's important to you at any given moment can really help with making these decisions and helping you to become more flexible and adaptable. And I think that's a crucial component of this as well. It's like, if you're understanding that, yeah, you don't need to necessarily optimize everything, it's very easy then to allow yourself to be a bit more flexible and adaptable with the way that you live your life. So if you're really valuing social connections, and for me, like a sense of adventure and excitement, like in that aspect, and exploration, those are things that are really important to me. That could end up with me, for example, that just use the example of when I was in Japan, I did a cooking class with my with a teacher there, and then she messaged me and was like, "Do you want to go out for a meal? Like we're all going out. Do you want to come?" And I was like, "Yeah, right then." So I was in Osaka and ended up going out for this like yakiniku restaurant, which is just like meat that you cook in
Oh
front
yeah.
of you. But it's like we went out, and then they were like, "Oh, we're going to a bar. Do you want to come?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure," because I wouldn't go to it on my own because I don't know how to order anything in Japanese. So it's just like a really off the cuff night. And like I had no qualms about doing that, even though my sleep was deprived. Like I probably ate a lot. Like, do you know what I mean? It's just like one of those things, because that's what I realized, that sense of adventure is important to me. And I'm not trying to tightly control my physical health, for example. Like that, if I was too caught up in physical health, I would be losing sight of these other things, because sometimes what's good for you in one sense may not be optimal in another sense. So what's good for me psychologically, emotionally, socially may not be the best thing for me physically in that moment in time. But again, when you even it out over the course of time, it's just like, as long as you're moving in the direction of something that's important to you and not compromising too much on letting things slip for a while, then I think it kind of all evens out. And I think that's really when you reach that state of flourishing. It's just having these things working synergistically together, but not necessarily focusing too much on any one thing at any given moment for a long period of time. So I think definitely thinking about this is probably, well, I'd say it's influenced the way that I live my life, but I also think the way that I live my life has influenced the way that I think about health. So I think it works both
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah, it's for me, I find it kind of comforting sometimes, and I'm wondering, am I just trying to justify my own biases? Because I'm like, hey, Gary, you can you can justify missing some sleep some nights and drinking too much coffee and having some pizza because
Yeah,
hey,
because that meaning of
health is
purpose is so
more.
important.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's all for the meaning and purpose. So it is obviously about, like you say, not necessarily trying to achieve balance, but have some sort of congruence between the different domains. Because it is fundamentally, like, I think of it as like that intention to be healthier within the framework of that definition is just like, it's just like some sort of magnet, and sometimes it will get pulled in other directions, and you know that you will get pulled back because, once you had that night out or whatever and you've had a few drinks and you've slept less, it's not that much of a big deal because you're like, well, I know how to eat well and what that means. And I know that my food choices will kind of come back to normal anyway. So it's not that big a deal. So it is just about having that intention rather than saying, like, having like a checklist of every single day, scoring yourself out of 5 in each domain, because I think that would be very anxiety inducing eventually. But what
Yeah,
was,
and well, the other thing is as well is like, so first we ask the question of what is health, but then like the question that comes after that is, why should I care? Like,
yeah,
why should achieving health be something that I strive towards? And there, there's many ways to answer that question. It could be a case of, oh, well, I don't want to be a burden on the healthcare system. I want to have energy to live my life and support my friends and family. Like, cool, awesome reasons. But then, is optimizing physical health, for example, adding any more? If that's your reason for doing things, like, does that really bring you any closer? Like, if you're healthy enough and you have sufficient energy day to day, what then does further improving your health add to that? Whereas if your health, like, for me, I think personally, the reason that I want to be healthy is to really kind of live my life in the best possible way and get the most out of it. And to me, that doesn't just mean having energy to be there for friends and family. It's like having a direction and, putting my energy towards meaningful things like we kind of discussed or touched upon. So it's like, is spending an extra day in the gym, if I'm doing 4 sessions a week, do I really need to do 5? Like, that extra hour and a half or hour or so is taking time away from something else that I could be doing. And if optimizing my physical health in that one extra session, if it even is doing that, is adding anything more to my purpose behind being healthy in the first place. Like, I think these are kind of questions that we need to ask. Like, why do I actually care about being healthy? And like, again, there'll probably be a bunch of things that go into that. So think about what is health, and then why do I care? Why do I want to be healthy? I think these are really the things that we should be thinking about, and that can help determine the way that we live our lives. I think that's the crucial thing there as well, is because like, health isn't just an on or off switch. It literally determines the way that you live your day to day. So I think it's important to get clear on what it means to you and why you even care in the first place.
yeah, yeah, because I think that, like, if you take that World Health Organization definition literally, like, no one is healthy. Like, you're just not healthy. Like, how could you ever achieve, what do they call it, a state of complete physical, mental,
Yeah.
and social well-being, the absence of any
What does that
disease or
mean?
infirmary? Like, I mean, what does that mean? Like, how could you possibly say that you are completely well all of the time in 2020? Like, there are 0 people I know who have been completely psychologically well throughout this year, throughout the pandemic. Even when you think about the things like the role that big tech plays in your everyday life in terms of social media and how that can affect people's mental health, concerns about the presidential election, for example, concerns about the rise of populism in Europe, and all these different types of things that are actually in everyone's everyday life that undoubtedly affect your well-being. Like, I don't think it's realistic to say that, oh, I'm never ever going to feel any sort of deviation. Like, I think that if you do feel like that, you're probably just deluded or not awake to what's happening in the real world.
Yeah, I actually think it's far healthier to think of it in terms of being, as I say, flexible, adaptable, and resilient. Because then we are
Mm,
recognizing that there will be, I don't know, threats to our health, where there will be moments where we don't feel completely healthy,
yeah,
and that probably is normal, as you say. Like, when we think about the environment that we live in, it's pretty much to be expected that there will be times when we're not feeling 100%, whether it's concern, uncertainty for the future, fear of what may happen. That's just a sign that you have something to care about. And I think if we're focusing on being completely healthy, then one, we're probably misinterpreting what it means to be healthy, but also then again, that kind of determines the way that you live. Like, if you don't think it's normal to experience a bit of uncertainty, distress, whatever it may be, then that becomes difficult to then try and work around, and you may see it as like something to solve, whereas that's not necessarily the case. And I think the more acceptance-based approaches can actually be quite beneficial in that sense. Like, understanding the situation for what it is, and then doing what you can, like rather than trying to get rid of that uncertain feeling that you may be experiencing. How about just accepting it for what it is, and maybe like discussing it with people rather than thinking it's a problem that you face in isolation that needs to be fixed. It's like, well, actually, this is a normal experience, and if we can like come together, discuss our concerns, that's probably a healthier response than thinking, oh, this is something that's wrong, it's a fault of mine, when actually it's just kind of part of the human experience.
Yeah, you kind of end up thinking like, how does everyone else live so happily? No one else has any concerns except me. It's just me. I'm the only one with the existential angst. You know,
Yeah, and then everyone internalizes their
yeah.
own concerns. It's like you're actually thinking the same thing, but no one knows because nobody can talk about it.
Yeah, exactly. And you actually mentioned a few times there, related to another definition that I can't remember what the name of the paper was. You might remember, but it was basically the proposal of the definition of health as being I think it might have been brought up in the Vanderbilt paper, the ability to adapt and self-manage. That was actually one of the definitions proposed for health, because it's quite simple. It's more open to interpretation, which might sound like a bad thing, but I actually think for something as non-specific as health, I think it's actually a good thing. Like that ability to adapt and self-manage, so that, like you said, if there is a threat to your psychological well-being, for example, that you're able to say, that's fine. I've got strategies to cope with that. I've got meaning and purpose that keep me, on the path. And I think that's a really nice way to think about it, because you can actually also apply that to the domain of physical health, the things we would typically think about. Because, for example, the ability to adapt and self-manage could be because you have a higher level of muscle mass that you've accrued over the years, that when you get sick with an infection in hospital, you're able to adapt to that because you have more of a physiological reserve remaining. And you could apply that to various disease states, which is why I think it's nice and ties in very much with what you were saying.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's really important. First, you say like different domains of health as well, like physical, psychological, like you're thinking about psychological flexibility, the ability to adapt. And I think self-manage is quite important there too as well. And I like the fact that it's open to interpretation, because again, I think it's important to be able to think broadly about some of these topics, and then you can still tie it to the specific. So I don't know if you've come across the somato-psychosocial semiotic model of health as well, which I think it has, again, like these different domains. So the somatic obviously pertains to the physical body. You've got the psychological, which is kind of like your mental well-being, and educational health as well, and then social health. So that includes like where you live, like your housing and infrastructure, the environment that you live in, as well as the people around you. But it also has this semiotic component, which has things like your support, problem solving, even like a sense of spirituality, but it's your ability to make sense of things. And I think that comes into adapting and self-managing, is understanding what's going on and having that meaning there, and being able to respond to the situation in a way that favors you or the people around you. I think that's a crucial component, which I think we try to help clients with when we're like educating them. It's like, okay, here's the information that you need to make the choices that you want to make. But I also think alongside the education, it is really that self-awareness that I think feeds into that, because that kind of determines your ability to make sense of things, is understanding how it relates to you and your life, and what it is, again, that you're trying to achieve, and again, for the people around you too. So I think, yeah, having that understanding of the ability to adapt and self-manage comes into our pursuit of health as well. It's like, what do I need to know then in order to self-manage? I think, again, the educational component, understanding how your actions may influence your physical, psychological, and all the rest of it, but also having that clear understanding of why it's important to you. I think that's the crucial part.
Yeah, and you brought up something there that I wanted to actually segue onto, and that was, you mentioned the role of that spirituality could potentially play in that equation, because this is probably one of the areas that I probably had the biggest U-turn in terms of my thinking.
Yeah.
And I think I've spoke to a lot of people who are in a similar position, because I suppose to give some context, like when over the years, like I would have always thought it was, cool to watch like Christopher Hitchens doing the Hitch slap, and I love Christopher Hitchens. I think he's a brilliant mind, but just watching the videos of like owning religious people, and I could never, like, even as a child, I was speaking about this recently, I always felt really uncomfortable with the concept of religion. Even when I was young, when I was in school and everything, I always felt really uncomfortable with it, because I genuinely looked around and I thought, how are all of these people so stupid? How on earth could you believe that there is a God, and why do you do these rituals? It made me feel really, really uncomfortable. And I was actually in an Orthodox church in Minsk in Belarus about 5 years ago. And I remember it was like a 4 hour ceremony, and I just walked in and like walked out or whatever. And I just remember seeing everyone like worshiping or whatever. And I just remember feeling so uncomfortable with it. And over the years, as I've been exposed to thinkers of a different era, of a different way of thinking, I've totally changed the way that I think about religion, because now I'm like, oh, I understand that I walk with a God-shaped hole in my chest that is potentially compromising my well-being, whereas other people are able to dampen some of their concerns about, what does it mean to die, those things. Like, I would love to, I was just talking to Kieran O'Regan about this week, that I would love to, for a day, spend just spend a day thinking that, oh, that when I die, that I'm actually going to go to heaven and there's going to be something else afterwards, rather than thinking, when I die, I'm going to decompose in the ground, the liquefactive process is going to take place, and that's me done. And everything I think and everything that I say to you, Shannon, that it's just a result of some sort of emergent property of neurons interacting. Like, how depressing is that? But yeah, what do you, I'm not going to ask you a specific question, but what are your thoughts on that, like the role of religion and stuff? Has your mind changed on anything like that over the years?
Yeah, 100%. Pretty much exactly what you said. I've taken a complete kind of U-turn about the role of religion and spirituality and
Mm-hmm.
what that means for us in like the modern day as well. And I guess it's not a novel thought. You've got the whole,
Oh,
I guess it started with like the whole Enlightenment, and then the God is dead. Like we realized, yeah, okay, then maybe there are other explanations for things. But I've actually just finished reading Consilience, which would be a book that I'd recommend for you, by Edward Wilson. And he had a line in it which kind of sums this up perfectly. And it says, like, the essence of humanity's spiritual dilemma is that we evolved genetically to accept one truth and we discovered another. So we
yeah.
discovered science, which kind of left this empty hole in our lives, because we're like, oh, okay, there is no divine purpose. There is no, there's nothing else to what we have other than this. But we have like symbol forming minds that need we need like consolation from grief. We need explanations for the unexplainable, and this is rooted in our psychology and our biology, like that we just need, that is something as part of being a human. But then we don't have an answer for that now that we know more about the way that the world works. And I think that's kind of a huge crisis that we're facing right now. Is like, oh shit, where does this leave us then? Because I'm not going to worship necessarily something that I don't believe in, but at the same
Yeah.
time, like we crave a sense of purpose. Like we need that to be able to make sense of the world and to be able to explain things that maybe don't have, there's no reason behind. And I think if we're thinking about humans in terms of like, if it's part of our human nature that we're compelled to find an answer for these things, like what is the point, how do we fill this hole? It doesn't necessarily matter if that's just something that is a property of being human. Like it doesn't matter if there's no kind of objective meaning or purpose.
Mm-hmm.
If that subjective thing is very real, because it's still real, right? And I was recently listening to a conversation between Tim Freak and Daniel Schmachtenberger, and about kind of the hole that science has left in that respect. And Daniel said that something that I would agree with is that the philosophy of science is an inadequate epistemology for understanding the real. So it's a way of understanding the objective reality, our closest approximation to what is going on in the world, but that's not to be conflated with the whole and the real. So the objective reality of the world is just a subset of what is real. So that kind of opens up the door then to what does it mean to be spiritual in, you know, the modern world where we understand science, and again, we don't necessarily have a way of explaining this need to have a sense of meaning and to be able to make or have explanations for these things that are unexplainable. I think understanding that there are limitations to science and what it can do for us. So if it's just a tool to try and understand the objective reality of the world, it doesn't tell us what to do with that understanding, or why we should care, what should we look into, and how does that new understanding determine the way that we act and the way that we behave in the world. So science is an important part of that. It's a necessary part, but it's not sufficient. And when you look at the literature on the relationship between like spirituality and health, we actually see like a positive relationship there, and it comes down to things like faith, optimism, resilience. These are all kind of important things that influence our physical and our psychological health. But where do we get those things from? And having a sense of community, like that's a really important component of religion. So if we're not religious and we're not spiritual, are there other ways that we can get that sense of community and to have that faith, to have that optimism? And I think that's quite a difficult question. I'm currently reading a couple of books on this topic. So I've got Myths to Live by Joseph Campbell, and The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James, which is a psychological study of religion. So I'm trying to ask that question now.
Yeah.
Given that I'm not religious, how do I find like it's clearly serving a function in people's lives? Why do people pray to a higher purpose? Why? What does that give someone? It doesn't matter whether or not they're correct, objectively right or wrong in believing in certain things. It's about understanding what is the purpose of that and what does that offer someone, and then how do we reconcile that with our understanding of science. And I think that's definitely something, as you said, that has been overlooked. I know that I've overlooked it in the past, or even looked down upon these people, and now I'm like, they were onto something. Let me just figure out what that was.
Yeah, and I was actually speaking with a priest about this about 2 years ago. He's the funniest guy because he's like, I think he's from Norway, and he's like your classic like gigantic Norwegian powerlifter type person with a big beard and shouts when he deadlifts and stuff. But he's a priest, so he's such an interesting character. And I was actually speaking with him about my experience with like listening to like Jordan Peterson's lectures and stuff like that, and how it just kind of changed the way I thought about religion. And he was taking me back to, I was asking him, what made you become so religious? Why did you go down this path as a priest? And he was saying that initially what happened was he was in a car crash and he survived, and his wife died or whatever. She died. And then he went on to basically, he said that he had experiences with God, whatever enlightening moments he had. And he said that this was his path, that he needed to, go and teach the word of the Lord, as he says. But yeah, I still, even having conversations with someone like that, when they're genuinely thinking like this was a very objective experience, that I saw God, I spoke to God. Even now, it still makes me a little bit uncomfortable, because I'm like, I understand what you mean, but you actually mean it very literally. Whereas I'm interpreting what you say metaphorically, which is actually something that I think is still a problem, because it, as an atheistic or agnostic, gnostic, whatever box you want to put yourself into, you're still trying to go back and reinterpret those things through the lens of science, through the lens of knowing or thinking that there doesn't happen to be a God. So you can still never actually replicate the experiences that those people are describing, because the literal and the metaphorical interpretations are different. So that's why I say that I would love to walk the path in the shoes of someone who was truly spiritual and was truly religious, so that I could kind of have those experiences. But yeah, it is interesting because you can go back and you can try to interpret those things through the lens of science and say, what happens with functional MRI or something like that when someone has a religious experience? But again, we're still missing the forest for the trees there, because we're still just trying to look at something that we can correlate to the experience rather than accepting it like for what it is, as some sort of, I don't know, real or meta real experience that someone is having.
I think there might be a way of reconciling that. Um, Even if it's something that, you know, we will never believe in, like objectively, that there is a God or whatever, I think there can still be a way of reconciling that scientific understanding with the purpose of religion and what that feels like. Because if we understand, again, like the limitations of science, so yeah, science can tell me that my amygdala lights up when I'm
Yeah.
scared of something, but it doesn't tell me what that fear feels like,
Yeah.
what it actually feels like to be scared. So that then is like a limitation of science, but that feeling is still very real. So can we still get that feeling of the religious experience with a scientific understanding? And I think there is scope for that. Again, it's not a question I have an answer to right now. Probably may not have a certain answer to either. But it's definitely something that I think can be explored. Because again, what is it that people are getting out of this, and how is that making them feel? And I think we can find out, at least have some answers to that question. And if we're thinking about, again, we've got a good sense, or we're trying to get a sense of the objective reality of the world, but then to answer the question of what can we do with that and how should that determine how I behave, I think is something that you can still explore. And it's not something you're necessarily going to look to science to answer those questions, right? This is when people turn to philosophy, or when they turn to religion, is to give them these guiding principles or just insights into how they would like to live. And I think these are things that we can do. You know, we can put these understandings into practice. We can develop like a strong moral compass, you know, guiding ethical principles that we want to live by. And we can then put those into place with how we interact with other people and how we operate in the world. And I think that is kind of edging closer to those religious or spiritual experiences, but we actually utilize it. We can utilize science to move us towards that as well. Like, they don't have to be two competing things. I think there can be congruence there, because if we've got a better understanding of the world, then surely that should enhance our ability to answer the question of what should we do with that understanding. You know, like, it's very difficult to try and answer the question of how should I behave if you don't understand the world that you live in. So I think science is a tool for maybe serving that question, but it's not sufficient, it's not enough in and of itself. So we still need to kind of ask ourselves these other questions too. And again, that could come down to understanding myths. You know, why do we have these repeating myths in different cultures over time that kind of persist? You know, what is it that's common about those things, and where does that come from, and what function do those myths serve? And I think having a little sense of things that, you know, a little sense of wonder, things that can't be explained necessarily, I don't think that has to make you less scientific. And I think that's a kind of common misconception there. And I actually think that sense of wonder, that curiosity, can enhance our scientific understanding. That's how we create hypotheses, isn't it, anyway?
Yeah, and it's actually something I struggle with when I think about like the future of humanity, and we won't solve this problem on on this podcast as much as we'd like to, but it's the fact that science is very much like, what science does really well is produces and tells us what is, but it doesn't, you can't derive the ought from that without knowing what you're actually aiming at. And that's difficult thing, is like, what do we all agree on? And when we say all, you know, you might say that, okay, in the West, if you will, we mostly agree on these things, but does everyone? And are we all going to aim at that? And what about other populations of the planet? Do they agree with everything that we're saying? Because if we're going to move the Earth, like for example, I was reading about Elon Musk last night that he was talking about the laws that will apply on Mars, like basically saying that SpaceX will create their own laws for the way that Mars will run, which is just a really funny way of thinking about where we're going. But yeah, I just think that question of like, are we all in agreement with what we're aiming at? That's actually something that's really difficult to establish on a scientific basis. Like you can't get all close to 8 billion people together to ask them what we should all aim at. So yeah, it's a difficult one, because if you have very large portions of the world's population who still are very much true believers of their God, of the mission that they've been set out by their theological doctrines, etc. And then you've got the other parts of the population that are saying, well, we're going in this direction because we're concerned about the environment and we're concerned about the future of humanity, and we think that we should move in this direction, because they're actually very difficult things to reconcile. But I won't ask you how we do that, because I don't think we know how we will do that, or where we will be in 500 years. But yeah, no, there was something else I wanted to bring up on that topic. No, I don't know. Oh yeah, that's what I was going to say, is that like this is something I think I heard Douglas Murray discuss this initially, but I don't think he's the first person to use this phrase. I think it might have been Roger Scruton, I'm not sure. But basically talking about that God-shaped hole in your chest, that all of us have in some way a God-shaped hole in our chest, because the human, like we all as humans have the desire to explain the world, to explain like why we're here, what we're trying to achieve, what happens after we die, etc. And I think it's interesting to think about what is filling your personal God-shaped hole. You know, is it just the strict pursuit of your career, for example, or is it, I don't know, your family, your kids, or is it social justice, for example? I think that is something you'll actually see filling the God-shaped hole of many people's chests these days, where every single event is reinterpreted through the lens of like social justice and intersectionality. And in some cases that can be a positive thing, and in some cases it can be very, very divisive, I think. But further to that point, what was I going to say? Oh yes, healthism. This is what I wanted to bring into the conversation. I'm not sure if you've heard the term healthism. I think it was initially coined by Richard Crawford in 1980 in some paper. But basically this over preoccupation with health in every domain of life. And you know, I was speaking about it earlier in the week, and I was saying that like if you wake up in the morning and the first thing you think about is, how do I do something to better my health? So you're thinking about your breakfast, let's say, and your breakfast, everything in the breakfast is oriented not towards the taste experience or anything like that. It's does this make me healthier or less healthy? And then you go outside and you meditate in the air because cortisol reduces and the HPA axis, etc. And this is your reason. And then on your way to work, I don't know, you're listening to the Triage Method podcast where they're talking about health. And then at work, you're a personal trainer and you love lifting weights for your clients to set up their exercises, because again, that's exercise, blah, blah, blah. You do that all the way through the day until you get to the evening. And then you've got your evening wind down routine, which again is oriented towards enhancing sleep, affecting melatonin secretion, etc. Every decision in your life is guided by health, like that healthism, and that is filling that God-shaped hole, because your whole life is oriented towards like that physical health as the end, not as a means to anything, but as the end in and of itself. And something that's interesting is obviously we see that emerge in the personal training world and the fitness sphere, but I was actually reading up about this topic as I was waiting to discuss it with you. And as always, I think as we've mentioned in DMs to each other, Trisha Greenhalgh has written about this. She's written about literally everything. Yeah, she's written about everything. And that's Dr. Trisha Greenhalgh for people who don't know her. She's a GP from the UK and a researcher. But yeah, has basically written about absolutely everything. And she wrote a paper in 2004 that was dedicated to this idea of healthism, and how it's this kind of phenomenon that you see primarily emerging among like middle class people who are generally more educated, they have more choice, and it's basically just this whole idea that, you know, everything needs to be natural, and every single decision needs to be supported by certain health behaviors. And she actually has here, she does a table that I took out from the paper, the demographic, the attitudes, and the behavioral characteristics of healthism. And what else does she say? Vocal and articulate, they consume food supplements, they're concerned about unnatural substances, higher degree of consumer choice, etc. And that all of these things, she actually goes through a number of case studies where this lady, she has a child, and from the moment she's pregnant, every single decision that is made is based on I don't know, the removal of toxins from her diet. And what else does she have in there? Meditation and things that different just weird kind of pseudoscientific things that are supposed to make birth easier. And she has a natural birth, and afterwards she's not going to give the child a vaccine, and the child's on a vegan diet, etc., etc. But the whole point being that almost every domain of life is absolutely consumed by whether or not it adds to or detracts from health, which I think is, I'm not sure if I actually have a question. I just think it's interesting. And have you seen, I guess, these examples of healthism emerging in your world?
Yeah, 100%. Again, when people come to work together to improve their health, then it's very easy to develop a preoccupation with, you know, health being the primary focus of your life. And I think this, you know, comes back around to that question: is why do I care about being healthy in the first place? Like, yeah, it's important, but how important is it, and what else is important, and how does that, you know, do these things conflict? Because if we're chasing health just for, as you said, a means to an end, or in and of itself, like what are we doing this for? And it's very interesting to note the types of characteristics of the type of people who, you know, fall into that trap. And I think that, again, I don't think it's like a personal failing. I think it's just an
No.
understanding of, you know, like the society that we live in and the way that this is actually tied into a book called The Wellness Syndrome, which I think is really worth reading. And it's along a similar line about how we're kind of, you know, with the rise of like fitness trackers and corporate wellness programs, how we're conditioned to believe or fall into the trap of believing that optimizing our physical health is a way of improving our social standing or improving our performance at work, you know, and having like these step targets to reach, drinking these juices and these smoothies, and as you say, optimizing your sleep routine. For what end? Why? Like, for what purpose? How is this serving me, or how is this serving the other people in my life? And I think it's, again, in the Wellness Syndrome, they kind of attribute that to capitalism, just like the world that we're living in, trying to, you know, operate or trying to improve yourself as a worker, and how, you know, optimizing your physical health can increase productivity, and you'll earn more money and be more successful if you could just be healthier. And it's very interesting, because if you went to, again, like these third world countries, or if you're experiencing a crisis, like, are you in the middle of a crisis looking in the mirror, like flexing your abs like when other shit's going on? Like, it makes a lot of sense how we kind of take a myopic view on things, but I think that really detracts from other things that are important. I think that's probably why I care about this a lot, is because I'm thinking, you know, what does this mean if someone's preoccupied with their appearance, or if someone's preoccupied with macro tracking and counting calories, like, you know, obsessively, to a point where it does detriment, you know, other aspects of their life? Like, what does that mean then? What are they not seeing? If that's all they can see, what are they missing? And I think those things are the really important things to consider. So yeah, falling into the trap of just optimizing your health for the sake of it, I think you could potentially be risking missing out on the bigger picture. And then who's left to answer those kind of questions about, you know, what do we do in the world where there's people, like there's school kids who aren't getting fed now? Who's going to care about that if we're all too busy obsessing about our own health and like flexing in the mirror and, like I say, spending too much time on my fitness pal? Well, then what about all these other concerns? If you're too tied up in your own personal health and, you know, your own personal life, then what about the broader aspects of that? Or what about everyone else who doesn't have the opportunity to even consider their own health, right? If someone's just trying to survive, just need some food to live. They don't even have the opportunity to improve their health because they're just trying to stay alive. And if we're all wrapped up in our own individual health, who's going to help people like that, you know? And I think those are kind of the questions there that I think are worth thinking about. And it's not an individual failing to be concerned about these things, and it makes total sense when you understand like the roots of these concerns. But I think if we're in a position where we have the privilege and the opportunity to even consider optimizing our health, then again, to what ends? Like, what am I going to do with that? And I think one potential route could be to help those people that don't even have that opportunity in the first place. That's just a very random way of answering that question, but it's just
Yeah,
something
no,
that
no,
I've
I
been
think you're dead. I think you're dead right. I think it's fundamentally like, you know, just another branch of consumerism. Fundamentally, like that, you know, that you can basically create a commodity out of anything. You know, that if we have more information about what it means to be healthy, and we know that people have achieved Karl Marx's dream of people now having more leisure time. You know, if you're a member of the middle class and you work your, I don't know, 35 hours a week, maybe 30 hours a week, some people work part-time, that you've got all this leisure time. And if within your social circle, we create an environment in which the act of being healthy, health behaviors themselves, the removal of natural or unnatural products, etc., and consuming things as naturally as possible, that all these things become values within your social circle, then again, the market is just there to satisfy you, you know. And you see this all the time in the way that our generation and people older than us, the types of foods that we consume, and that there's a classic example of some guy who starts talking about his daily routine where, you know, he wakes up and he has activated almonds that he's soaked, and then you have like all these different types of herbs and spices and special teas, etc. It's almost like you just take the things that look romantic from other cultures, like, oh, look at this cool Eastern tea and this aspect of Chinese medicine, etc., and they're just fed through the consumerist treadmill of the West to willing consumers who want to have some sort of status. You know, it's, you know, people do yoga, not necessarily, or a lot of people do yoga because, again, it's kind of like a status symbol. It's like, yeah, I'm a vegan who does yoga. Like, that's me, that's my tribe. We're those kinds of people. And fundamentally, it's like signaling within certain classes of society, which I think is just interesting to ponder. Like, why do you do what you do? Where did you derive your values from? And because it's not to say that yoga cannot be beneficial or that there's anything wrong with being vegan, but it's just funny how they emerge as these kind of these class phenomena a lot of the time.
Yeah, and that's a really important question. Like, what, again, with the signaling, what are we trying to signal and why? Like, are we trying to, usually it's like, oh, we want to fit in with people, so we value that connection and that safety and that security. So that's reasonable, right? That we do that, or that we want these things. But then what are we doing to achieve those things? If you're going to yoga just to improve your status, it's like, or are there other ways of securing that connection that is actually what you're seeking? You know, and then we can relate this back to our the things that we do to improve our health. Like, is that necessary for achieving the ends that you're actually trying to achieve? So if you want that social connection and that safety and that security, is that really going to come from having apps? You know, is that what, because that's kind of the trap that people fall into, like, oh, I need to improve myself because I'm always striving to be better. And I'm like, yeah, that's a great quality, but what are you striving towards? And is the thing that you're, you know, the thing that you're striving towards actually serving what you're trying to get out of that? So that can really inform the way that you then go about setting goals, you know, and then what you do to achieve those goals. So I think introspection and having a sense of like your values are two things that are really important. And again, it seems quite abstract, but it really does relate to your health, because if health is something that emerges from the way that you live your life, well, then having an understanding of your values is going to be important to determine how you should live your life. And introspecting is the way that we kind of get to that point, because there are like a number of influences, as we've discussed, with the environment that we live in, that we're pushed towards these things. Like, yes, I should be improving my health, I should be optimizing things, surely that's the thing to do. I want to achieve financial success, I want to have a bunch of friends, I want to be successful. It's like, yeah, but why? We're so conditioned to think these things, and again, understandably so, but I think we have to take a step back and ask ourselves these questions. And the only way to do that, I think, is just, again, to have those times where you do introspect and think about what's really important to you, and whether the things that you're doing actually achieve the thing that you're trying to achieve. So yeah, if you're trying to fill a hole with your fitness endeavors, what hole are you trying to fill, and how else can you fill that hole? So it's not about saying, oh, we shouldn't care, we shouldn't train. No, of course we can still do these things, and they offer a bunch of benefits, but what else can we do in addition to that to really fill that hole? Because if the fitness is the only thing that you've got going on, then it's likely to be insufficient to fill that gap that you're trying to fill. I think we may need more, in addition to that.
Yeah, and I mean the signaling exists in multiple forms, and fundamentally, like all of us signal in some way, in the things that we do, whether it's the clothes that you wear, the language that you use, the way that you structure your Instagram bio, the photos you take, all of those things are in some way signaling like, hey, I'm one of these types of people,
Yeah,
if
this is what I care about.
yeah,
This is
this is what I
what's
care about.
important.
Look, this is me. This is what you're getting. These are the main things. And it's just funny how you see it on polar opposite sides of the spectrum. Like if you go to a lot of vegans on Instagram, they'll have the little vegan like logo thing. It's like a little leaf plant thing. And then, they might have whatever other interests. So they'll signal a lot of things related to the fact that, I'm a vegan, come here. This is a safe space for vegans. It's like, cool. All right. But people will mock that. But simultaneously, if you go onto any of the carnivores pages, they're even funnier because I'm not sure if you've seen it, they put the little copyright C in their name to indicate that they're a carnivore. And they also have, the steak emoji in every single post. Again, signaling like, yeah, I'm part of the tribe, and very often that comes along with things like that, I'm going back to nature, and they'll have photos of lions and stuff. And it's like, whoa, dude, like you're cool, man. Like look at you lion, it's just, again, it's just signaling to the same types of people. And what you'll often find is that, which I think is fascinating, is that those dietary ideologies are very much like, they're not, a lot of the time, they're not just nutrition decisions. They're much, much broader things. Like a lot of the time, if you go to people who are in the kind of low carb, keto, carnivore space, you'll find that they also will be the types of people. There's a lot of people now who are, completely anti-COVID, think that the whole COVID situation is just a government strategy to mass vaccinate everyone and insert chips, etc. And what it comes along with all these other sort of kind of conspiracy beliefs that, Ansel Keys was brought in to just get us all eating carbs and eating sugar and making us sick and stopping us from eating saturated fat, which is the real key to health, etc. And there are these clusters of beliefs that exist together and that they don't exist in a vacuum. And all those things, for me, when I look at them, I'm like, that is filling some sort of God-shaped hole, because you're finding some way that very clearly explains the world that we live in, that there's this whole conspiracy that's going on. And for the record, like conspiracies can be true as well. Just, I'm not one of those people who think they never happen. They absolutely do. And power corrupts. But with that said, again, it's an attempt for people to try to explain the world around them. And if you can create a situation in which all the structures of power and all the institutions of your society, if you say that they're all corrupt and they're all designed to make my life worse, then now you almost don't have to take responsibility for anything in your life anymore either, because you're like, well, everything else is corrupt. So, that's me. Here's my explanation of the world. And it's real comfortable because certainty is nice. Like it's nice to feel like I would be healthy if it wasn't for, I don't know, the special toxin or preservative that they put in my food. That's the reason that everyone's unhealthy. It's much harder to come to the realization that the reason that health has been affected, let's say with cardiometabolic disease, for example, is for very, very complex reasons related to the economic system, inequality, the marketing, for example, and all these different things that are coming together to fundamentally create a situation where our environment is totally discordant with the evolutionary apparatus that we've been given. And that's really, really hard, because there's no simple way. Like, I can't just turn around and say, everyone just eat meat, or everyone just take meat out of your diets and you'll be healthy. Instead, it's like, yeah, I don't know. There has to be some complex solutions, but I can't explain this one away very simply, you know?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think you've kind of alluded to the fact that we all signal to some extent, and we all try and make sense of things to some extent. And whether that's, leading us into these ideological circles or whatever, that there's a reason for it. And if you understand that you're going to try and come up with these reasons on your own, like these platforms kind of invite us to signal, right? If you've got an Instagram, someone's going to see whatever's on your page, they're going to see your bio. It's like, what are you going to put on there then? And so we're always exposed, and we're always presenting ourselves. So understanding that that's kind of probably something that you're going to do, I think then even makes that question of why do I care, what's important to me, blah, 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 is even more important, because these are natural like tendencies that we have. We want groups, we want safety, we want security, and we do signal. So making sure that, I think you've really thought about these things, what you want to present and what's important to you, it all circles back to that. And yeah, like understanding, I think another component of this is actually having like empathy for other people. Like we can laugh at people who go vegan to join a group. We can laugh at the people who take up a carnivore diet, but it's like, why have they gone down that route? Why do they believe this? Again, it's always serving some sort of purpose, some function for them. Like, yeah, maybe they don't actually care about being carnivore, but they found a group of people that they can share something in common with, and that kind of provides them with a sense of security. Maybe it has nothing to do with the food, maybe it has nothing to do with improving their health, or maybe they do genuinely believe that. It's like, okay, so why do they believe that then? Maybe they've been fed this information that probably sounds fairly scientific, it sounds reasonable, and they don't necessarily have the critical thinking skills to be able to navigate that information for themselves and make sense of things themselves. Like, part of this is understanding that belief is motivated by something. So, and that's not necessarily just the truth. Like, we like to believe things that already align with things that we think are correct, and we discount information that disconfirms our beliefs. And the belief in and of itself has a value. Just simply holding a belief is valuable to us. So again, having that understanding, I think, is really important when it comes to, again, figuring out why people believe the things that they do. It's like, oh, actually, there's something there. They're trying to gain something from it, and then you can start to use that understanding to question your own beliefs. Like, why do I want this to be true? Why do I want health to be the answer to this God-shaped hole? And is that really the case? So yeah, just thinking about these things, like, what is health doing for you? Why do you care? What hole are you trying to fill? What other things can you fill that hole with? How do you relate to other people who may have different ideas to you? How do we understand why people come to the conclusions that they come to? These are all questions that have kind of spurred out of that initial question, what does it mean to be healthy? It's like, think about all these things. So I think if we're understanding health as the way that we're living our lives, all of these things are related, and they're all questions worth pondering, I think. And that helps you to make sense of yourself, helps you to make sense of other people, the world that you live in, and then the way that you relate to other people and the world that you live in, and consequently the way that you should behave and what you should even pursue, whether that's improving your health or not. Like, understanding the function that each behavior is serving. What is it serving? What are you trying to achieve with that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely huge. I think that anytime you observe something that you think is absurd or stupid or whatever, that should never be an isolated observation. What it should be is a prompt for self-reflection. Like, I think that is incredibly important because, like you said, you have to be empathetic towards the fact that people come to their beliefs for some sort of reason. There's some sort of motivation, and I think to assume that stupidity is the answer, or to assume that malice is the answer, that someone is trying to be malevolent, like, I think that's probably a bit reductionistic and self-serving, because it assumes that you're on the right side of truth, and that's the dangerous aspect of it. And I was just speaking about this recently, as it relates to the, like, people again in these kind of nutritional ideological camps. Like, let's say you are someone who is on a carnivore diet, or you believe that it's the cure to everything. Like, I can completely appreciate how someone, particularly if you don't have much like training in science or medicine or whatever, that you would come to that belief. Because fundamentally, the way that social media works is that I encounter this information. I like this information. It seems appealing. So maybe I start modifying my behavior. And then I get all this positive reinforcement from people who have the same beliefs as me, but not just people, also from the algorithms of social media that keep feeding me more information that confirms what I already believe. So for that individual, when they look at the landscape of the health information that they consume, it's already in line with what they believe. I know that now, like, there are like interventions from social media companies to say, if you want the truth about this, visit this website or whatever. But for the most part, you're still often being reinforced with information that already confirms your beliefs. Like, if I go on my Twitter recommendations, because I primarily go on Twitter to like observe the kind of low carb, keto, carnivore community, like, I just follow so much of their shit. Like, so much of my recommendations are people with like steaks in their Instagram bio or in their Twitter bios, because that's what I consume. And if I was not someone who was willing to or able to critically analyze the information that was being presented to me, I can very easily see how someone would fall down into this path. So for me, it's not a case of saying, all right, all these people are stupid. Like, I do definitely look down on people who are the thought leaders in those communities, like Paul Saladino, etc., because I think they are charlatans, but the individuals following them, not necessarily. But for me, what it does is it causes me to ask, one, like, what am I signaling on my social media? So when people come to my page, like, what are they thinking? Like, what box or category of person will they put me into? And that's actually something I've deliberately reflected on for a long time. And it's the reason that, like, in my personal bio, it just says health, science, and philosophy. Because, like, what does that mean? It's like, okay, you said health, but I mean, I don't know what your dietary ideology is. I don't know how you train. I don't know what your degrees or education is. It's just like this open-ended thing. And that's what I would say to people, is that I think if you can, if your ideology is an open-ended meme rather than a closed meme, I think that's really helpful, because that's fundamentally what, like, one, if we think about health, we've clearly made a mess in this conversation of saying that, Jesus, health is kind of complicated. When we talk about science, science is fundamentally a method of inquiry, not a specific body of fixed knowledge. So it's open-ended. And then philosophy is very much a similar thing. It's a process of questioning things and trying to dig down to the roots of things and asking, why do we believe this, etc., etc. So all of those things are open-ended, and it doesn't put me into a box, because it means that, oh yeah, my beliefs are probably going to chop and change, and they'll be all over the place. And maybe someone would say that I'm closer to maybe the vegan side on this issue, but maybe the carnivore side on this issue, or whatever it happens to be. And I think that open meme allows you more freedom and flexibility in terms of even the way that you think, because it means that I don't have to constantly experience cognitive dissonance when I encounter something that contradicts what I believe. I'm sure that does happen, of course. But if you have a closed meme of sorts, like, I don't know, you're a runner and you think resistance training is pointless, or you're someone who just loves lifting weights and thinks that cardio is for idiots, or you're a carnivore and you think vegans are dumb, you think plants are bad for you, or you're a vegan and you think dairy is just absolutely the worst thing you could consume, then anytime you encounter information that counters any one of those beliefs, you're forced to block that out. You're forced to experience the cognitive dissonance, the anxiety inside, and you find some way of rationalizing your previous worldview. And I would say that even if you are correct, I would rather be slightly incorrect and have gone through it through that kind of open-ended process than to be correct just by chance and still to be in that fixed position. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but that's the way I kind of think about these things.
Yeah, no, I think that's extremely important, that open-ended process. And I think, because the thing is, we all have preferences and we need beliefs.
Yes.
Like, beliefs in and of themselves aren't bad, because we need to come to some sort of conclusion to decide how to act, right? Like, even if they're tentative beliefs or, approximate beliefs, like, we need them in order to make decisions about the world. But the issue comes from not holding a belief, but holding it too tightly,
Yeah.
and not seeing the room for other beliefs as well. For example, like, I have my own preferred way of eating, but I also don't look down upon other ways of eating. It's not like it's my way or the only way and this is the best way, and I'm open to changing that. So something that I've actually been thinking about recently is, I'm sure there was a time in my life where I laughed at veganism, and
Yeah.
I certainly have no intentions of becoming full vegan, or I would never call myself that. But I have recently been questioning my decision to eat meat purely out of convenience, because that's kind of what I do. I just go to the supermarket, I would pick up meat or animal products just because they're convenient, and that is habitual for me. And then I was thinking about, well, why do I care so much about human life if I don't really care about animal life? Like, how is that really something that I can reconcile? Like, what's the reason for that? And I would used to be like, oh, well, eating meat is natural, that's what animals do. And it's like, yeah, well, animals do a lot of things that we probably wouldn't do either. So is that really a good, and when you keep like breaking it down and thinking about all these things, I'm like, I don't really have a good reason to be eating meat purely out of convenience and habit, when there's this question about whether or not causing unnecessary suffering is a good or bad thing. Like, I don't know how I feel about that question, and I don't need to necessarily have an answer yet in order to think that potentially just picking up meat out of convenience, when there are suitable alternatives that are, equivalent, why would I then do that? So, like, that's just something that I've been thinking about recently. And since being in Portugal, I haven't bought any meat from the supermarket. I'll still eat out and eat, what I want off the menu, which includes animal products. But I've been eating seitan since I'm here. And I'm like, that was a really easy swap for me to make. And I haven't really had to think about going vegan, because again, it's not, I still eat dairy. It's not necessarily something that I'm considering changing yet. But that's just one belief that I've now changed. It's like, oh, I probably don't have a good reason to be buying meat out of habit when I can literally just pick up the seitan. And that doesn't, I now don't have to, think too deeply about the question of whether or not I agree with unnecessary suffering or whether I'm causing unnecessary suffering, because that was one just simple way for me to be like, oh, okay, let's just change this one thing that I'm doing. So holding your beliefs tentatively, I think, is really crucial, and making space for other people and their beliefs. So not, as we've touched on, not laughing at someone else for doing something differently to you, and being open to changing your mind, and then also understanding why are we so hesitant to do that. And I think it is because these beliefs provide some sense of certainty, maybe even a sense of identity. Like, this is the way that I eat, this is the way that I train, I am a bodybuilder, I am a powerlifter. Like, what is that doing for you, and is that really good and adaptive long term? So being very fluid and understanding that everything is a process, and I think that's really crucial. And as you said, like, philosophy, science, these are all open-ended pursuits. So we should then be equally open-ended in our own pursuits about the way that we live, but also holding these beliefs tentatively. Like, again, it's okay to have them, we need them, they serve a purpose, but then being able to adapt, and then I guess self-manage as well, all ties in together. So just I think really thinking about your own framework of thinking. But it's very disconcerting when you think about how easily swayed and influenced we are, and how much we like to tell ourselves we operate out of pure will and intention, when actually a lot of our decisions are probably operating outside of our unconscious awareness, or at least the factors influencing our decisions are. And if we don't stop to think about why when I scroll down my social media feed do I see these things? Like, what is that feeding me? What am I not seeing because the algorithm has figured out what I like,
Yeah.
and it's excluded things that would be would not reconcile or would not be congruent with my beliefs. So what does that mean? What am I missing? And taking that understanding again think about how you relate to other people. And this feeds back to health. So you've touched on some examples, but also, why do we assume that it's a personal responsibility in the case of, say, obesity, when actually obesity nowadays is primarily a result of poverty? So how can we look upon these people and criticize their food choices when it's maybe a structural issue? And again, we like to think that personal responsibility is the answer, but if that's not the cause of it, then it's not going to be the solution either. So just thinking like broadly about these things, I think, is really crucial. Just understanding how easily influenced we are, which again comes back to asking these questions. Like, we need to find ways of breaking that, well, not necessarily breaking the chain of influence, because some of these things aren't preventable, but I think just taking the time to stop and ask these questions, you can at least reorient yourself when you are influenced, and understanding why you're behaving in the way that you're doing, whether you are, and how that relates to how you think about other people. I think that's really, really crucial too.
Yeah, and both of those areas that you mentioned have actually been like significant sources of me like re-questioning my own beliefs. Like, for example, in the vegan context, I think like there's actually like if you wrestle with the best arguments, not the worst arguments, the best arguments out there, for things like animal rights and the non-inferiority of plant-based diets, etc. I think you'll actually find that even if you're someone who is very strong meat eater, that you'll be able to respect a lot of the beliefs that those individuals have. And to be honest, like I've listened to a lot of debates from a guy called I don't know his second name. He's Isaac He's Ask Yourself on YouTube, and he's big into like philosophy and ethics and metaphysics, etc. He basically just tears people apart in these debates, because he creates like these logical trees, and like it's just very mathematical the way he does arguments. And he has this kind of this phrase that he uses, which is name the trait. Name the trait that if true that what is it? Name the trait that that is true of animals, that if true of humans would justify killing them and eating them. And it's actually a really strong argument, which very few people actually come around to arguing well. Like, he asks it to Sam Harris live. It's actually really funny to watch, because Sam Harris is just tripping all over his words. And I would rather in that position to have just said, yeah, I'm not sure, but I still eat meat, But anyway, that's not the purpose of this discussion. The other thing you mentioned was the personal responsibility discussion, which I think is an interesting one, because I actually think that while I'm actually I think that there's some people who sit too far on the other side of the spectrum on this as well, which I think is important, because if you look at some areas of social media, you will see people who basically remove all personal responsibility, to the point where I believe it almost denigrates the person's autonomy, which I think is something worth considering from a medical ethics perspective, because I've seen certain doctors who will say that they never recommend or discuss weight loss because of the statistics related to the success of dieting, for example, which is interesting, because it is a dilemma where, well, you still have to present the potential for success of the intervention, for it to be ethical, for the person's autonomy, so they can make the decisions. And if it doesn't work, they were still able to make the decision. So I think that's kind of a back and forth you could have, but it is something that's worth considering for people, is the fact that, like, has personal responsibility or motivation just massively declined in the last 50 years? Like, no,
Yes.
it clearly hasn't. Like, there have been other changes that have occurred in the environment, and like responsibility for your behaviors, and or let's say the intention or the free will to make those decisions, is that a mediator of whether or not you are obese in the current environment? Of course it is. But is it likely that you're going to be able to intervene with a personal responsibility intervention on a public health level to solve these problems? Absolutely not. So while you as an individual and I as an individual have the freedom, and to make decisions and have the ability to take responsibility, for my diet, I recognize that in certain changes in the environment, in my economic circumstances, in food availability, in access to buses to take me to the shop, to public transport, etc., that all of these things are very strong mediators of, you could say, even my willingness to partake in those health behaviors, but in general, as an outcome, the health that will come from that. And it's not just obesity either. You also see this in, like, I think it's really worth people understanding that all these domains are, like, it's beyond obesity. It's also things like, osteoporosis, for example. An example of that would be, if you're an elderly individual, let's say, and you have low social support, and you happen to, be, you're not very well off economically, you don't have the means to pay for, I don't know, meals on wheels service, meals to be ordered into you, or you don't really have much of a family around for you, then as a result, you could actually accelerate the process of osteoporosis, because you don't really have the mobility to cook for yourself, or the desire to cook for yourself anymore, because it's a real difficult task. You don't have the money to pay for the meals. You mightn't be able to pay for the ingredients or the supplements that might prevent osteoporosis in someone like yourself. And because you don't have access to public transport, you can't get to the shop. You don't drive. You can't afford a car. You don't have people you don't have things in your community to take you outside the home, because you live in an area of low socioeconomic status. There's not many things for you to be able to do. And as a result, you have poor levels of activity. You've got poor nutritional status that have been influenced by all of these different variables that result in you over the years having worsening osteoporosis, and then potentially something like a hip fracture, which could be tied back again to your financial security, the people in your life, all of these different variables that we definitely miss if we just think of health as these very rigid kind of physical elements, you could say.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Like, you just highlighted just how many factors do influence it and how many variables there are. So I think just understanding that health is far more complex than probably what we even understand now.
Yeah.
It's not like we know how everything works, but just understanding that there are a number of factors that influence our health. And again, it's not about like maximizing all of these things at once or anything like that, but just having a clear idea on what it is that influences your life, and then how you go about living that life in order to secure health, and what really health means to you, and also what purpose it's serving for you and why you even care in the first place. I think those are kind of like the key things that we're trying to highlight in this conversation. And again, understanding that not everyone is entirely, or we're not all responsible for everything that happens to us. Like, there are things that we can influence and things that we can't. And understanding that, I think, is an important part of relating to other people, and the way that we, again, hold these beliefs towards others. Like, why do we like to believe these things that are that we think are true to us? Like, what does that mean for us? So I think that's probably the main thing that we want to highlight with all of this. I think that what we're getting at here is that health is far more complex. We can't reduce it to simple things like macros and body weight or whatever it is. And also what purpose is this trying to serve for you. And although it's an important part of your life, it's probably not your whole life. So asking yourself these questions now, and continuously asking yourself these questions as well, because these things change. Like, what's important to you now may not be important to you at some point in the future. These are all practices that I think we should engage in to help move us towards the direction of improving our health and the way that we kind of live our lives day to day, and relate to other people. I think that's kind of the whole point of this conversation here.
Yeah, and I think to kind of round out the discussion, I think one final thing that came up there, or as you were discussing, and I was thinking, was the fact that if we make like health and healthism this like perfect ideal, then one of the things that can emerge from that is an element of shame or guilt for not being perfectly healthy. And this is actually one of the things I worry about a lot, because like you see this in different different, like, again, going back to the poor carnivores, sorry for bullying the carnivore so much, but in the carnivore diet community, you have this kind of culture of shaming people for taking things like statins, for example, if they've been prescribed a drug to lower their cholesterol or modify some other, let's say, their blood pressure or something. And while I think it's positive to celebrate someone maybe not needing medical intervention because they've managed it otherwise, I think we do run the risk, if we put like this health on the pedestal, of making people feel like they have failed if they have some sort of condition. And you see this manifest a lot of the times with like autoimmune disease, for example. People feel like there has to be some sort of way that they can solve this through diet, because like the pure state of human existence is perfect health. That's what we're putting on the pedestal. So it's understandable that people would feel shamed or feel guilty if something does go wrong with their health. And I think one of the things that emerges when you begin to study medicine or the area of healthcare generally is that anything can go wrong. It's actually amazing that we're even able to have these conversations and to talk about something like health, because of the amount of things that can potentially go wrong in every single cell, in every single organ system. And that, it's fine for someone to be in a state of ill health. I don't mean fine as in desirable, but I mean that, you haven't done anything wrong. You're not a bad person because, hey, your LDL cholesterol is elevated and you need to take a medication. There's no shame in that. Is that something, I suppose, just to add to that, another element then would obviously be the domain of mental health, for example, that, shame and guilt surrounding the need for intervention. Because I've had some clients struggling with depression who have actually had great outcomes from medication and cognitive behavioral therapy and, seeing professionals. And they almost feel at times like it's a failure if they have to go back for intervention, rather than being able to, just do it through diet or do it through exercise. So is that something you've seen emerge, like in your everyday life or in your coaching practice specifically?
Yeah, 100%. Like, I work with a number of people who feel ashamed of where they're at,
Hmm.
like how the state of their physical health or whatever it is, and thinking like they're not good enough because they haven't been able to achieve the same things that someone else has been able to achieve.
Yeah.
I think we should be really careful ourselves. If you find yourself looking down on someone because they're not as healthy as you, or however you judge that, or they can't achieve the same things as you can in your training or whatever, why are we deriving so much of our self-esteem from our ability to stay healthy or to improve our health? Like, why are we getting our sense of, as I say, self-esteem from that? Because I think that kind of relates to how you then judge other people. Oh, well, they're not good enough because they can't control this aspect of their health. But why does that make you a good person if you can do that? Because what we're doing is stigmatizing these struggles that people
Hmm.
face. And the issue is that we don't really understand the complexity of the struggle or how they ended up in that circumstance. And the funny thing is that if you had lived their life and were brought up in the same environment and had the exact same influences and the experiences that they had, then you'd probably be exactly the same. So we like to think that, oh, I've achieved this great thing by being able to manage my health. But like, yeah, sure, for you in your current environment, like, that was something that you pursued and you had these certain opportunities. And obviously, although it does take work and we like to pride ourselves on that, I think we tend to discount the role of these other influences, and then that lends us towards judging other people for not being good enough for achieving the same things, even though we can't quantify exactly how these influences have impacted the behaviors that someone engages in. If we're going to play this game of who's better than the other person, then we need to have a very good way of judging all these separate things and computing that. And that's beyond our cognitive abilities, that we can't weigh up all of these things to determine who's got the stronger will than the other person or whatever it is. So we should be very careful about where we derive our self-esteem from and how that relates to how we judge other people. And then opening up the floor for people to be able to talk about these things, as we say, and creating that safe environment is really important to help someone actually, if they've realized that this is something that they want to work on, then they need to have suitable opportunities and capabilities in order to improve that. Like if you look at the COM-B model of behavior, motivation is one component of that, and the other part is capability and opportunity. And if people don't have those things, then it's going to be very difficult to change their behaviors. So it doesn't make any sense when you understand it from that perspective to judge people for not being or achieving these same things, because we don't all have the same capabilities, the same opportunities, and there are different things that influence that. So yeah, and I think that all does derive from it a lot of the time from us wanting to get a sense of self-esteem from our capability to manage these things. Like that's what makes me feel good about myself, so therefore I can judge someone else for not being able to achieve the same thing. But are we judging them because that really is an accurate, calculation of their will and their value system? We've actually decided that health is something that's valuable, which is why we determined that we can judge other people based on that, which is, you can question that to begin with, but also, as I say, how are you actually calculating these things? And if it's just, usually it's because that belief is serving a function for us, and that's making us feel good about ourselves. I think we can question that too. So yeah, just to bring it back around, understand that there are a number of influences. Not everyone has the same amount of control over these things. Everyone's subjected to different things. I think that understanding is really what gives us empathy towards other people, which it's not an excuse, which I think is a common misconception. It's actually just a greater understanding of how complex this is, just how complex like life is in general, and behavior and motivation and opportunities. So I think all of that just comes back around to, yeah, it doesn't make any sense to be able to judge other people on that. And there definitely is a huge sense of shame and guilt. And I think if you're working with someone who feels that way, or even if you feel that way yourself, I think it helps to understand really how complex it all is. So yeah, that's probably a little ramble there, but just some thoughts that come to mind.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you reflect on the kind of fitness industry, and particularly the side that maybe swings more towards the kind of functional medicine side of things, because what ends up happening is you actually take the worst of both worlds, where you you incentivize the over medicalization of everyday life. So you incentivize more things coming under the bracket of diagnosis or ill health. So you make health something that's really difficult to achieve. But what you also do is you disincentivize appropriate intervention and appropriate diagnosis of those problems in the first place, which is almost a recipe for guaranteed suffering. Because what you've done is you've said that health is up here and something that's like really, really difficult to achieve. All these different things can go wrong. Like, for example, over medicalizing, like having a bit of back pain every now and then, or things like posture, like, oh, your posture isn't perfect, we need to fix all of that, or the feeling of fatigue every now and then, or your mood being a little bit low every now and then. All these things are kind of part of the normal human experience, and very often what you'll have is that people will kind of just prey on that a little bit by saying that these things can be fixed with these supplements, or this dietary intervention, or this special daily routine, or whatever. But it actually disincentivizes any sort of proper treatment for actual medical problems. So if you're let's say if you do have fatigue, let's say, and you've been assessed by a functional medicine practitioner who prescribes supplements, and I don't know, gives you these explanations related to methylation, etc., and they never actually refer you anywhere for proper fatigue assessment, if that is a genuine medical complaint, then you could be, missing a diagnosis of something like cancer. And no, I'm not saying that if you feel fatigued every now and then that you should be worried about cancer, but these things do happen. So it is a really interesting dilemma where you take the worst of both worlds, where you incentivize the over medicalization of everyday life and disincentivize someone actually being treated properly for those problems. And yeah, I just don't think that's a good way to run an approach towards better health and well-being.
Yeah, we do the exact same thing with weight management as well. Like someone who we perceive to be overweight and they must lose weight in order to be healthy. Well, potentially it's not a case of just, oh, they just need to eat less and move more, which is, the general or the common rhetoric there. What if we're assuming, again, we're missing the bigger picture, and it could be a case of, you know, they've experienced trauma, and that's why they struggle to reduce their food intake, because they eat in order to, you know, get rid of these strong emotions that they're feeling. So we're trying to slap a diet on top of that, which isn't solving the problem or getting to the root of the problem. So I think it's, you know, we see these things all the time.
Yeah, and also I think that in that context as well, you could say that very often, again, you're setting the bar unreasonably high by someone who, like, if you're trying to lose weight, like when you see the outcomes of weight loss studies that are successful, what you see is that like 5 to 10% of body weight can lead to fairly considerable improvements in health that would be meaningful clinically. But very often, I think like the goal in a lot of people's minds is, yeah, you know, I'm 100 kilos, my BMI is 36 or whatever. I need to get to 60 and be ripped, and then I'll be happy and I'll be healthy. You know, that's the target, which is, again, just really making it very, very difficult for people to feel like they've accomplished something in terms of moving towards better health.
It's so frustrating to see that, because it's so common.
Yeah. But yeah, Shannon, we've tackled a lot of difficult topics. We almost found the direction of the way that the planet should be going for the rest of the future and how to fill our God-shaped holes. But hopefully people took something out of this conversation. One final question for you. You got a new tattoo yesterday, I believe. What's the meaning behind the tattoo? I think it's a cool
Yeah, so
story.
I got a small tattoo on my forearm. It's one that I wanted when I was in Krakow. So what it is, it's just a floral design on my forearm. And the reason that I wanted to get this tattoo is because whilst I was in Krakow, I spent a lot of time, I guess you could say, like meditating on death, because I went to the concentration camps. I went to Auschwitz and Birkenau. They have the Gestapo museum there, Schindler's factory. So obviously trying to understand what it is that happened, and just the gravity of the situation, which I really don't think, even having like read all about it, and been to these places and like stepped in the places where these things occurred, I still don't think I will ever really understand what happened, and you know, what these people went through, or even how we got to that stage. So I see a lot of value in like meditating on death, and the point of that, and like the benefits that can bring. But I then had this moment where I was walking around the botanical gardens, just like unexpectedly just stumbled across them, and was just like wandering around, and yeah, thinking about all the things that had happened, and just like what that means for human nature, given that, you know, this, again, I don't think these people were uniquely evil in any way, or not a lot of them anyway. Yeah, just thinking about like death and human nature, and then I just noticed, like, I was just looking at the flowers and just noticed like just how beautiful they were. And I had stumbled across a quote, and it's something along the lines of, everything has its beauty, but not everyone sees it. And I was like, yeah, like that's so true. Like, yeah, we get caught up in like these tiny things, and we don't stop to notice like just how good we have it. And I think we can complement, you know, the meditating on our own death with meditating on life as well. Because the thing is, like, we can attempt to think about what death means, you know, what that really would be, or what that would mean to the way that we live our lives. The fact that we're not here for very long, we're all going to die at some point. You know, that does have these huge implications for the way that we behave. But we don't know, we can't really truly understand that, because we won't experience death until it happens, and then we probably and that's it, right? So these are just like this, we're very limited by our own cognitive abilities when it comes to meditating on death. Whereas meditating on life, that we've all experienced what it feels like to truly live in the moment. Like these, if you think about like the best experiences of your life, that can evoke some kind of felt understanding as well, not just like this cognitive process that we go through meditating on death. Like, you may have had like close relatives die, or, you know, friends die, and you can, I guess, there'd be a stronger impact there. But for someone like myself, who's like never really experienced that, yeah, I can go to these places, look at, you know, and understand, or try to understand like what's happened, but I'm still going to be limited by my own ability to think about these things, whereas life is something that I have experienced, and I've had those moments that have been like really fulfilling, really rewarding and meaningful. So I think complementing the meditations on death with meditating on life as well, I think is even more powerful. So yeah, I just wanted to get a tattoo of just a floral design based on the photos that I was taking in the botanical gardens, to remind myself of like the beauty of life as well. Because yeah, we know what we're trying to avoid, but we also need something to move towards. And I should send you this paper actually. It's I read a paper on the psychology of existential risks, why lay people aren't as concerned as we think we should be about catastrophic events ending the world. And part of they found that most people believe that near extinction is almost as bad as complete extinction, whereas if you were thinking about it logically, surely complete extinction would be the clear worst case scenario, because there's no prospect of future life. 80% extinction, yeah, pretty bad. A lot of people are dying, but you could restart civilization, if some people are still alive, versus 100% complete extinction. Everyone's dead. There's nothing left. That should be the worst case scenario. When probed further, people do come to that conclusion that complete extinction would be the worst case scenario when they're prompted to think about long-term consequences, but also when the salience of the significance of that event is increased. So thinking about how good life would be in the future with all these increasing prospects that we have, the potential that we have as humanity, which is getting better and better, but we're just combining that with increased risk of shit going wrong as well, which is like the situation that we're in. So you need some of that optimism that like Pinker brings, that actually would increase our concern for existential risk. So I think that just is probably a bit of a confirmation bias, given that I just got this tattoo. I'm like, yes, that makes a lot of sense. Like when people genuinely see the benefits and the long-term potential that we have, then we suddenly care more about what we're doing right now, and how that can, bring us closer towards achieving that potential, or just ruining it for everyone. So I think that was a very long answer, but that's kind of the tattoo I got, and there's just things that I've been thinking about recently. I think meditating on death, very useful, but I think having that optimism for the future and really valuing life is important too.
Yeah, I kind of swing back and forth hourly on those two thoughts. Like one is like just being like, yep, I'm gonna die. None of this matters. We're all going to die. The sun is going to
animated dust is all meaningless.
The sun is going to engulf the earth. This is all just pointless. And then the other side is like, oh man, we have so much potential for progress. Look at all the things that could potentially happen. We can avert these crises, etc. So yeah, that's just an hourly back and forth thing. But there you go. As I said, I think we've tackled a lot of difficult problems in this conversation. Really, really enjoyed it. And maybe have you on again sometime to discuss more of the world's problems. But in the meantime, I know you're doing a lot with the comprehensive coaching, and you've had the Bridging with the Gap series, etc. But do you want to point people towards some of your work where they can find out more?
Yeah, sure. So if you want to learn more about like the comprehensive coaching techniques that we use, and the kind of approach that we take, again, to relating it back to the concept of flourishing health, how we can help people determine that for themselves, then keep up to date with things that Gabrielle and I are doing. So we have a comprehensive coaching community, which is our Facebook group to discuss these things. There will likely be another webinar series sometime next year. So probably the best place to keep up to date with that would just be either of our Instagram accounts. So you can find me at Shannon Beer _. I also began offering mentorships because people were asking for those. So that's something that I do now. And yeah, just seeing what happens next year, where all this goes. I think that'd be the best place. Oh, and the other place would just be my website as well, which is shannonlbeer.com, I believe. I don't know that. You can find things like the articles, but also my reading list. So if you're a big reader, then I have a lot of recommendations there. Yeah, those probably. Oh, and I recently started doing a podcast as well. I guess you could call it that. So just loads of places to find me, but most of it is all on my Instagram as well. So it's probably the best place.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think you wrote an article titled "What Does It Mean to Be Healthy?" not so long ago, and it covers a lot of the things that we discussed in this podcast, along with links to some of the articles that we mentioned. So yeah, I'd recommend that people check that out, and also definitely check out Shannon's reading list because it's excellent and covers a lot of the kind of the types of topics that I think are definitely worth considering for people working in the health space, like related to philosophy and religion, etc., that very often don't get discussed. And if you found this conversation interesting, then there's undoubtedly lots of books on there to take you further. So to everyone that listened this far, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Shannon, for being here. And hopefully we'll speak to you again soon.